Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started today. Very excited for this webinar. My name is Sasha Beatty. I am Senior Counsel at the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. APA is a private nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., serving prosecutors as well as their law enforcement and community partners. Thank you for joining us for this Case Backlog webinar series today. This project is supported by the Stand Together Trust. APA is very appreciative of their financial assistance and commitment to improving the justice system. Points of view or opinions in this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the association or of our funder. Now, just some very quick housekeeping. We've also shared this information in the chat, but if you have any questions for the presenters today, please use the Q&A widget that's found at the bottom of your screen typically, and we will hold questions until the end of the presentation, at which time our presenters will address them. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, such as audio or video issues or any other questions, please pop into the chat box, which is also typically found at the bottom of your screen, and let one of us know. This webinar is eligible for 1 hour of California MCLE. Attendees are required to self-report. Please reach out to APA-admin at apainc.org if you have any questions. Finally, after this webinar, you will be asked to complete a 1-minute post-webinar survey. So please do that. That helps us provide superior training for prosecutors nationwide. So it is my pleasure to welcome our presenters today. District Attorney Jared T. Williams was born and raised in Augusta, Georgia. He is a graduate of Georgia College and State University and earned his law degree from Stetson University College of Law. While in law school, his first job was an unpaid internship at the DA's office. Less than a decade later, he was sworn as the first African-American district attorney for the Augusta Judicial Circuit. DA Williams gives God all the glory for his accomplishments and is focused on making our community safer by protecting families and encouraging our young people to stay in the classroom, out of the courtroom. Also joining us is Chief Assistant District Attorney Kevin Davis, who was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. A high school basketball star turned college athlete, he developed the skills of leadership and teamwork on the court that he now uses in the courtroom. A graduate of the University of Georgia School of Law, he began his practice as public defender in Augusta. After helping elect the first progressive district attorney in the Augusta Judicial Circuit, Kevin saw he could do more good for the community by helping usher change in the DA's office. He serves as chief assistant and was instrumental in the creation of the pretrial diversion program, as well as the launching of the major crimes division in the DA's office, where he served as head of the violent crimes and gangs unit. Guided by his faith and aided by his focus, Kevin is widely regarded as the most accomplished trial attorney in the Augusta Judicial Circuit. And with that, I will turn it over to you both. Thank you so much for being here today.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to share my screen. And when I was elected, I was the youngest DA in the state. And do not for a second think that that means I'm technologically savvy. So my tech knowledge is limited to video games. So I will try and not mess up my presentation. Hopefully y'all can see that. So thank you to the APA and to the funding source for allowing us just to be part of this program. It's made a difference, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. I got a few slides. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on that because I think there's a lot of room for us to answer any questions that prosecutors might be having. So let's just jump right into it. So I'm, again, Jared Williams. I was elected in 2020. I started in office January 1st of 2021. And when I started, I ran for and won a 3-county circuit. Shortly after my victory, one of the counties decided to secede from the union. And so we are now a 2-county circuit. We focus on Richmond County, which many people know just as Augusta. If you're a golf fanatic, you're going to be watching Augusta very soon. We actually just got our master's tickets this afternoon. And then also Burke County is our rural county, and we're not as well known in Burke County, but you might know it as the home of the newest and one of the largest nuclear energy power plants in the United States, Plant Vogtle. So our community is made up of those two counties, but really because Augusta is the largest thing going for quite a um, perimeter around us, we end up serving a lot more than just who our residents and our population are. So while Augusta, Richmond County is over 200,000 people, and Burke County is about 25,000, about 235,000 is our actual residents, but we are part of the larger Central Savannah River area. And I'll show you on the map what that looks like, but it ends up meaning that we serve a little over 600,000 people who either live, work, or play, or some combination of those within our circuit. And so the DA's office prosecutes felonies in the adult courts, and then we also prosecute misdemeanors and felonies in juvenile court. And our trial attorneys are mostly working in our superior court. We do have duties in juvenile and magistrate, and then we practice in the courts of appeals in the Supreme Court. At full staff, we have 29 attorneys. Currently, we have 23. We have one that just got sworn in today, and we've got another starting in 2 weeks. But that's kind of a challenge that I know a number of us are facing, is just trying to recruit and retain talent. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we also have victim advocates, legal assistants. We have a new category of staffer that's relevant to this conversation because we created that level for this initiative. But we now have 4 paralegals, as well as our licensed sworn law enforcement officers, our investigators. And I guess this is as good a time as any. We had an incident where we have some inmates that escaped today from another county, but they are actually in our circuit. So if I jump off of this thing like really quickly without warning, it's because something's happened with that. But our investigators are actually out in the field trying to track down one of those individuals. So this is the CSRA map, Central Savannah River area. This is Georgia here. This is South Carolina there. We're split by the Savannah River. And so both Richmond and Burke County are these two here. But we service all of this based on most of the industry being within our 2 counties. And so we'll just kind of go through some of the numbers. I'll share 2019 and 2020 and then 21 and 22. Burke County stays pretty steady. They are definitely not a huge contributor to our caseload, but they are significant because when crimes happen in those communities, because it's smaller, it's very impactful. There's a lot of ripples. So about 250 to 300 cases in a given year. Whereas Richmond County, we're having about 2,300 cases a year. 2019 to 2020, there was a reduction in overall felonies, but then we also saw an uptick in murders. That was the summer of 2020 and on was a very bloody time, as I know it was across the U.S. Going back to Burke County, 21 to 22, we had a spike. I think that was, borne out in the numbers across the U.S. as well. No matter what type of jurisdiction you come from, a lot of cases were upticking during that time. And then it started to level out in 2022, and it has continued. You see those same numbers for Richmond County. But our kind of sweet spot, if you will, is about 2,300 to 2,400 cases a year in Richmond County. That's if we're in those numbers, we're on the lower side, which is where we like to be. But as you'll see, the difference between 21 and 22 was really in the murder cases. So there were a number of issues that we dealt with, and I think if I were able to see each of you and ask you to raise your hands, I would imagine asking the question, how many people had a backlog before COVID? I think most people would raise their hands and say yes. COVID did not create the backlog. It exacerbated it for sure, but really it shed a light on it And what we found is that there were just processes that were bad. And if I can take a moment, Kevin and I were both defense attorneys previously, and what we saw from our DA's office prior was a lot of not being reasonable, not attempting to resolve cases, or thinking that everyone should go to prison. And that resulted in kind of a slow kind of grind. And we felt as we were running for office and then getting into office that simply being more reasonable would help reduce the backlog, right? We created the pretrial diversion program. We created a lot of opportunities to help first-time felons not end up in that cycle of incarceration. And that's all great, but it hasn't necessarily borne out in reducing the amount of traffic, the amount of cases that our prosecutors have to handle. And so when they are already overburdened, and then it's almost like drinking from a fire hose, where the intake of cases is just going and going and going. We realized that it was not simply a prosecutorial culture. There were some built-in inefficiencies in our judicial system locally, and there was also some cultural issues amongst the bar itself that was keeping us from being able to resolve cases in a timely and effective manner. And so I'm going to talk about some of the mechanics, but we'll lace in some of that culture as well. So the biggest thing was there was about a 90-day delay between the time someone gets arrested and the time that they would be assigned a judge, a superior court judge. So someone gets arrested, they're not necessarily going 90 days without seeing a judge, but they would go until they were either accused or indicted, which in Georgia, most of our cases have to be taken to the grand jury. And until that happened, they weren't getting assigned to a judge, and therefore we didn't have any idea who their lawyer would be unless they were the type of client that got out of jail and immediately went and got a private lawyer. The other issue with that is whenever they would file into the case, because there was no judge assignment, the clerk's office essentially had a general docket, which meant that if there was not a case number assigned by virtue of accusation or indictment, whatever you filed, whether that be an entry, a motion for bond, order for bond, whatever it might be, it was going into the ether. It was going, I mean, if you just imagine people just throwing paper out the window, that's basically as effective as that general docket was. And so we realized that part of the problem was we didn't have any way of tracking a warrant and assigning it to a judge. And so part of our APA project was identifying that problem and then working with our partner agencies, our partner in the clerks of court for our 2 counties, the court administration, our chief judge, and getting with them and having them recognize that this is a problem and getting them to help us fix it. So that 90-day delay was a real problem. Also, that would result in the intake staff being overwhelmed because they're trying to not just resolve or not just get the serious violent felonies put through grand jury, but they have all the theft cases, all the lower level drug cases. And that's difficult just in and of itself, just from sheer numbers. Our trial teams were being overrun because every week they are getting 15 to 20 new cases. And I mean, maybe they're resolving that many in a week, but it's disheartening to like have a good day of court where you resolve, 10, 15 cases, and then, every Friday you're getting another 20. And then most of those cases are lower level, but then when you get to the serious violent felonies, because the grand jury team was so overburdened with their work, they haven't done the investigation that they need to in order to make sure that only provable cases are getting to the trial line. Talked about that. And so if I could just illustrate to you what the intake process looked like before partnering with the APA, this would be it. And so afterward, this is kind of how we're going. We're still, on a unicycle, but we're still juggling, and we're at least keeping it together. So our old assignment system, I already kind of laid this out, was a post-charging judge assignment. So we would either accuse the case or indict it, and then the judge gets assigned. It goes to arraignment. That takes a really long time. What we switched to was a better system. But the other problem with waiting until your case is arraigned is that you don't know who the lawyer is going to be on the other side. You don't know what public defender team will be assigned. And most of our cases are handled by the public defender's office. And so most clients are getting out of jail, and they're not going to get a lawyer. They're really not concerned about their court date until they get the arraignment paperwork. And so there's no one working on their case on their behalf. And then as those cases come through, I mean, they're not going to take the place of, what's most pressing to the trial lawyer, which is the upcoming trial from that week, whatever it may be. And so I talked about the pleadings not being properly filed as well. So our new system is warrant tracking. And what we do is the judge is assigned as soon as the warrant is executed. And so we completely kind of changed the process, working with our clerk's office and working with our sheriff's records department to make sure that when warrants come in, when someone's been arrested, they send those through the proper channels, and then they assign a case number at that stage. And while it is still uncharged by our office, cases can be filed into. We now, because we know who the judge is, we have a good idea where 70% of the cases are going, because we know which public defender teams run that courtroom. It allows for us to have a hybrid between the vertical prosecution that we aspire to, the horizontal intake that we have been doing. And so basically, it's essentially we now have the opportunity to have our major crimes division handling vertical prosecution and vertical intake, while still keeping the horizontal for the sake of the trial line. Pleadings filed remain with the case. That's a big one. So internally, what we chose to do was separate our intake from our grand jury team. It used to be that we had one lawyer and two legal assistants, and now we had, prior to this change, we ended up going to two lawyers and two legal assistants to assist with both intake and grand jury. And I told you the problem with that is that they're just overburdened. And so by splitting those two out, we now have two lawyers and two paralegals that are going through cases, reviewing them, and sending out offers in discovery prior to charging. And so that's our rapid resolution process. The grand jury team is spared from having to deal with all of the theft by receivings, and they can now focus on the murders, the aggravated assaults, the aggravated child molestations, the things that really need more time and investigator attention. Again, I can't see you, but I imagine if I asked how many cases do you get from your sheriff's office or from your police department that need further investigation, I imagine every hand would go up. And so by removing the overall intake process away from our grand jury team, it allows them the time and mental bandwidth to look deeper into our cases and make them trial ready before they get indicted. And then the intake team, which I'm actually a part of, because I told you we only have 23 out of our 29 positions filled right now. So I'm taking a very front row part in that portion. Plus, it just helps me to know how to hire for that particular position. It's just by doing it. And so we absorb all the low-level felonies. The idea is to keep them from getting to the trial line altogether. We can resolve those cases within the first 90 days, meaning before we take them to grand jury, the better. We've expanded our alternative sentencing programs. We've perfected some of our accountability courts. But ultimately, the reality is there are certain crimes and certain offenders that are not moving the needle on safety. And those are the types of cases that go into this rapid resolution process. And so we brought on the additional staff. I say 2 paralegals and 2 attorneys, but sitting as the elected official right now and also in the middle of a campaign, I probably only count as like a half of an attorney, and that's being generous. But our 2 paralegals, and we have a new attorney that's starting next month to assist in that team as well. So we've had some positive impact. The biggest one is the grand jury our actual grand jurors are getting to spend more time considering the cases that we need them to. And our trial line is receiving 2/3 of the cases that they were receiving previously are now going to me and the intake team. And that's huge. That's a huge time saver, because now we decided not to take cases back retroactively. So if they've already gotten to the trial line, they remain there. But now if they resolve 20 cases in a week, they're only getting 5 on Friday, which is Fridays when we do our arraignments, and that's when we assign our new cases out each week.
And Jared, if I may, is this a fair time? I would just like to give another example very briefly of the amount of time just in the short time we've made this change. Our grand jury team, one of the attorneys involved in that team, she came to me just yesterday about a case that was a case that was close. Won't go into all the facts, but it was one that ultimately we decided does not need to be presented. And we did not need to go forward. But because of her now having the time to actually track me down, have a good 30-minute meeting about it, whereas previously they just have so many cases, they're just trying to push it all through and sort it out after indictment. We were able to make a decision that we think is in the best interest of justice, instead of having to go forward with an indictment and then later ask for the court's approval to dismiss it or reduce it or whatever. It just gave us the ability to try to more effectively administer justice on the front end. So that's something that just the time was not there before. She was constantly under the time constraints of going to grand jury. And so that was an impact that I saw that is an immediate, and I can actually put a case to that. That was definitely something that we wouldn't have had time to do before.
Sure. And I realized that I used the 90-day language a couple times, but didn't explain why that's legally significant in Georgia. So in Georgia, if you are in jail for a felony and you're not indicted within 90 days, then you are entitled to bond. And so when he's talking about the pressure of getting things charged, usually it's because if someone's accused of rape or murder or aggravated assault, you don't want to be the reason that they get back into the community if they are in fact a danger to the community. So that 90 days is kind of the window that they're working within. But Kevin's comment goes directly to my next point. It's just putting more attention on the serious felonies is exactly what we must be doing, because unless they are going to fund us at the level that we need to be in order to handle every case with the same amount of attention, we have to put our resources where safety most demands. And so this also just creates a lot less stress for our trial line ADAs as well as the grand jury team, which means better quality time spent with our victims. And I mean, the flip side is we routinely get to arraignment and there are people saying, I want to resolve my case. I want to get this done with, especially if they're still in jail, but even for those who aren't. This gives inmates, defendants, the time, the opportunity to have their case resolved without it staying on their record or staying kind of hanging over their head for years and years as these lower level cases languish behind the bigger ones that we're actually taking to trial. So our lessons learned, one is you've got to take progress even if it's not perfection. Perfection is not going to be possible in our line of work. And so just don't let the good be the enemy of the perfect. And so we always have had to learn that kind of over and over again. You know, sometimes you're waiting to launch something until it's just right. And unfortunately, we just don't have the time or the opportunity for that. So try it. If this is something that you're interested in, try it and trust yourself to work out the kinks as you go along, and have good dedicated staff who are willing to see it through. Another thing is that as you're bringing in changes like this, recognize that they are cultural changes. My grand jury team had a system that they used for years and years and years. It way outdated me. And it's hard sometimes to say, hey, you've got your job down to a T right now, but we're going to completely flip it upside down and we're going to do something different. And so you have to communicate the reasons for those things. And you have to lead in that way by making sure that everyone understands why you're making the changes and what it's intended to do to make their lives better. And that's that internal communication piece, but then also externally trying to communicate to our clerk's offices that were content with how they were doing things. Trying to communicate it in a way that's not lording over them. I could have just gone to the chief judge and said, this is what I want to do, make the clerk's office do it, make the sheriff's office do it. But that would not gain us consensus, and it would be harder for us to bring these changes along within our own agency. By bringing them to the table multiple times and working with them and talking through it, we got them to a place where they understood that a general docket was time wasted. It might seem like more work to create files at the warrant stage. Ultimately, it means that every bit of work that you do actually has value because we're now able to follow it through the life of a case. And then I would just say, learn to control only what you can control. There are always going to be naysayers. There's always going to be people who don't want to see that success or don't see your vision. You can't necessarily let that stop you from getting the progress that you need. Our ongoing challenges, again, reluctance to change. I use the term phantom rules whenever someone's like, well, we've always done it this way. They don't quite realize that you only do it that way because you don't realize that you can do it another way. Especially in the law, I feel like sometimes our staff feels like, oh, there must be a legal reason for why we don't assign judges until 90 days after their arrest. But really, it was just an impracticality that we were able to change just by saying so. There's definitely some discomfort with new roles, meaning that we've had to elevate some people into the paralegal role. We've also we've taken some duties away from certain people, and making sure that people understand that that all of this is meant to make us all better. That goes back to that communication piece. If you can communicate the vision clearly, then when the friction happens, you can keep people focused on what matters. Definitely in that same vein, just encouraging people because change is frustrating and it's scary. And I mean, if you got somebody who's making, sub 40,000 a year, right? You changing the way that they do their job matters significantly, right? Because they're already not making enough, and then on top of it, they're asked to flip everything they've learned and trained on and do it a different way. And so being able to encourage people through that and helping them see how this makes their work more meaningful and how it makes them have a bigger impact on the community, that's all part of leadership. Going to the future, what do we want? I mean, I just, frankly, I would love to have caseloads that come into line closer with what the ABA says our caseloads should be, which that sounds crazy because those numbers seem exceedingly low. in the abstract, but if you think about it, the more time and mental bandwidth that we can afford our attorneys, the better quality work that the victims get. And so we want to bring those caseloads down, and we can do that. While I cannot make people stop committing crimes, we can become efficient enough to get there. We certainly want to recruit and retain talent, and that is a challenge for us because Augusta is outside of the Atlanta metro. If you don't have a tie to Augusta, you're probably not coming here over an office in the metro that can pay 20, 30, 40,000 more. And so we have to do what we can to make the life and livelihoods of our attorneys here better. And so part of that is raising salaries, but also part of it is just making sure that the day-to-day is better. And in our office, an attorney who has only been practicing 6 months might end up trying their first murder. And so that is one of our selling points, is that you can get a lot of experience very quickly if you show the talent and aptitude. But just trying to communicate that. And again, no one wants to hear that if they're buried under 300 cases. We're going to continue guiding our fellow stakeholders because I think sometimes there's reversion to the mean. So letting people see the work that we're doing, understanding why this process is better, and communicating that. So when you have the time to sit down with that investigator and walk through his testimony 2 and 3 times, as opposed to a quick 10-minute phone call about what you want his testimony to be, that is, you got to tell them, that's why we have this rapid resolution program. That's why we do these things. Or when they're not spending, 8 hours in grand jury one day and they're only spending 2, again, explaining we created these new processes to make life better for you, and just communicating that. And again, just challenging the phantom rules. There are more of them. There are plenty of them throughout the criminal justice system. And so identifying them and challenging them and being unafraid to try something new. And our goal is just for the system and all of our partners to run something like this. We're still on unicycles. We're still trying to keep the balance. We're handling things, but we're also working in tandem and managing it all very well. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you both. And, at this time, if anybody has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A widget or even the chat box if you prefer. And we'll give folks some time to add those questions. Jared and Kevin, one thing that you all discussed in your sort of ongoing challenges is maybe stakeholders, both internally and externally, their reluctance to change, that usual refrain that I'm sure we've all heard with, that's the way it's always been. Can you drill down a little bit more specifically on some of the tangible steps, the chronological steps that you took to both internally and externally communicate these changes and bring partners along and sell them on your vision? What was your order of operations when you were communicating with external stakeholders, for example? Who did you go to first? Who did you feel were, maybe the more far along stakeholders, maybe some who were a little bit more reluctant, and how did you bring them along?
So part of it was just identifying those who had vision in other spaces and could kind of see the forest for the trees. And so for us, that was our court administrator. He's practiced in a lot of different places. And the problem in our circuit oftentimes is that we're made up of people who only practiced here. And so, I went to school out of state and worked in some offices out of state. And so did our court administrator. So being able to work through and work with people who have seen it done other places, they just have the ability to see past what we've always done. And so that's the first piece, is find a stakeholder, if possible, who at least has some vision for what the future could be, and then get them on board and get them on side so that they can help within their sphere of influence. And from there, it was really a series of meetings. I mean, over months. We just launched this process in January, but we've been meeting for over a year about it, because especially when you're doing things that change processes within other offices, it's really important not to step on toes. It's really important, or at least if you're gonna step on someone's toes, um, you know, let them know why. But the process of meeting and talking through the issues was really about listening to what those other people's challenges were, and then going back and finding workarounds to try and alleviate those problems. Now, at the end of the day, on the front end of cases, this is more work, right? It's worth it to us for the back end savings. But in order for people to see the value in that, we had to at least address those things that were going to impact them and try and alleviate some of those issues. And then also finding ways to give, right? There were certain things that didn't necessarily have to do with this project, but we agreed to in order to make sure that people understood we were coming to this willing to do more on our behalf as well. And then another part about the kind of systematic meeting process was building those relationships, because as you can imagine, there's not always trust between the DA's office and the PD's office. So when I go to the court asking for a new process change, the PD's office is thinking, well, why do they really want to do this? And what is the motivation behind it? And how is it going to impact our clients? So being able to build those relationships, build that trust, and explain how it benefits the other side, it was also really important. And then from there, it was kind of after every group meeting with all the different stakeholders, we would go back into our part of the office and say, now, how do we make these changes and how do we fix these things? And then another piece that I didn't talk about before was we went ahead and had our staff start training for this moment that we saw coming 6 months down the line. We said, we're going to go ahead and start. This is very in the weeds, but it used to be one lady who was responsible for the entering of all the new warrants into our tracker system. And we said, well, actually, we could spread that across all the different legal assistants that we have, and each team could just do it. And that makes more sense in a system where we're tracking warrants by team, because then the legal assistant for that team would be the one entering that. But because this system was not in place, we just had to manufacture that. And we said, whatever warrants come in, we're just going to split them equally amongst the teams so that they can go ahead and train, so that when January 1 comes and that order goes into effect, everyone's already trained up and ready to go, and it's not some huge wave of new work for them. And that gave us the benefit of, once the changes were initiated January 1, our office was already ahead of the curve, so that when other agencies were having issues, they could call us.
And if I can add briefly, because that was directly related to the external, because that was the question that you asked, Sasha. I want to speak a little bit to the internal, because that was as important as anything, right? And I think what Jared did, as that's not directly related to that, but was, I believe, instrumental in getting the internal stakeholder buy-in. We were not really an office before he took over that was having meaningful meetings with your legal admins, with your investigators, and with all the different stakeholders within the office. And since he's been here, really, before we really took this project on, really started to make it was a very intentional effort to meet with him personally, meet with those different agents, different stakeholders, and different divisions within the office, and then also to create the first actual leadership team that meets every Wednesday, and occasionally it has to be canceled, but we meet every Wednesday. And that, I think, was critical in getting the buy-in, because people don't like to change. As he mentioned, we've had employees who were doing it a certain way for a decade plus. And it's difficult, like he said, when somebody who's making a significantly lesser amount than the attorneys, but they're the ones that are going to have the larger change in their roles. It's difficult to keep your employees from revolting. But I think because he had built a culture that was, this is cliche, but it's the truth. He built a culture that was clear to these people: we care about you. We want you to be involved in the process. And like he said, even though we're asking a role change, we're not going to step on your toes without letting you know. And we're not going to do it without having a conversation where we want meaningful feedback. And so he created those spaces for the women who led our division with the legal assistants to give some meaningful feedback about how this can work, should work, how it's impacting them, how it will impact them. And so making them be a true part of the team in the decision, while the decision was ultimately Jared's and was going to be his, he did a great job of building that true trust that just, I want you to know what we're doing and I want you to feel a part of what we're doing, and not just feel like it's something that's happening to you, but happening with you.
That's fantastic. Thank you both for sharing that and kind of breaking that down. And I think that you homed in on something pretty key throughout addressing case backlog as a whole, which is that trust is this long process. It's a patient process. It's a co-design process. And really, you're not going to have any sort of programs or policies or changes really stick unless you do bring along your stakeholders and are willing to invest that time and that dialogue with them, right? So thank you for that. I have one more question for you, and kind of switching gears a little bit, but you all shared some stats earlier on in your slides, and I was wondering, how much has data played a role in your addressing of case backlog, if any, and what is your vision for the future there? Are there any sort of resources that you would like to leverage currently or that you'd like to see to really sort of capture data and use it in a way to address your case backlog in the future?
Sure. So I honestly can say we don't do enough with the data that we have available. And I don't think that we track all of the information that we should be doing. And so I've had a number of conversations. We recently got awarded a grant to work with Vanderbilt University on one of our programs that we started last month, so that they can track the data on that. But then I also had a conversation with Augusta University, one of our local higher ed institutions, about how they can assist us in kind of the ongoing office-wide data tracking and analysis, because I hate to be in a position where you're making decisions on policy based on anything other than what actually works and what's borne out in the data. And so sometimes we have to borrow the data of other similarly situated offices in order to make decisions, but we shouldn't have to. We should be tracking that better, and we should be really kind of laser focused on, here are the outcomes here, and how do we make sure that we are adjusting policy to match the outcomes that we want. And so I guess the answer to your question is it played a minimal role, but it could be a greater role in the future. And that's less about kind of efficiency metrics and more about efficacy. I want to know if we are resolving this type of case with probation in certain circumstances, with prison in another, with something in between, in others, what's getting the most consistent positive outcomes, which means, lack of recidivism, which offenders aren't coming back, and how do we replicate that? And what are the different variables that we should be considering?
Absolutely. I think you said it best. There's always opportunity to leverage more data. I see there's a spectrum of folks on this call or on this Zoom webinar today. And I'm kind of curious if anybody else has any experience with leveraging data that's at their fingertips to address case backlog. But I think that the common narrative, or the most frequent narrative, is that there's just not enough time and enough tools to really capture that information. And so where do prosecutors as a profession go from there? How do we use that to the best of our ability to really see what we could be doing better and addressing those inefficiencies?
So what we're looking at doing with Augusta University is having a couple professors that are leading it, and then working with their internship program to help have students come in and do the actual number crunching and information gathering and data entry, so that the professors can then study it and then report back to us. And so that's one way to work around it, because the challenge, as is the case in most offices, is we're barely funded to handle the justice mission. So anything above that is really eating into time and resources, and again, mental bandwidth. So getting creative about different ways to get the help that you need is a really big one. So if you have the benefit of having a college or a magnet school or something in your community, leverage it.
Absolutely, 100%. I would love to hear from some of our audience today, but I do have another question for you, which is, just kind of to recap, if there's one thing that our attendees and others who might be viewing this webinar in the future could take away from this, as sort of like the one thing that can guide them as they start to tackle case backlog themselves, what would you say to them? What advice would you give them as they're starting to examine ways in which they could do something maybe similar to what you're doing, or attempt to address case backlog in another way?
There are good organizations like the APA that are here to help, and just don't be limited by what you've seen done in your community. One of the first things that we did when we took office is we went and benchmarked with other offices within the region, throughout the state, and then even outside our state. And I just don't think you can learn enough about your circuit by staying only in your circuit. You've got to get out and you've got to see how other people are doing things. And even if there's an office that doesn't seem to fit yours demographically, there's still lessons to be learned. In the same way that I try to pop into different courtrooms and watch different lawyers, if you're in leadership in one of these offices, you should be doing that and kind of benchmarking with others, because there's just so much to learn and so much to steal and take back to your community. And that's all a benefit, and you shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak.
Great. Well, thank you both. I'm not seeing any questions from our group today, but I know that you both are willing to serve as a resource in the future if anyone wishes to reach out, as does APA. So I just wanted to say thank you both so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us today. It's really exciting to hear about the ways that you are tackling your warrant screening process, and how you have this holistic sort of continuum of how you're envisioning what's going to happen next. I think that's so important to kind of articulate that and have that vision. For our attendees today, this is recorded webinar. If you wish to watch it again or share it out with others, we will be putting this as well as the slides on our website within 3 to 5 business days, as well as our YouTube channel. And don't forget to take our post-webinar survey today, just so that we can continue to provide education and materials and content like this superb webinar today. So Jared and Kevin, thank you so much for your time and for sharing out what it is that you're doing in your jurisdiction. It's just fantastic. Thank you today. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Bye.